We hope you're enjoying your coffee or juice, cinnamon roll, cheese muffin, etc. And we would like to thank the Institute of Creative Writing for the morning's snacks. Thank you, Director Gonzales. Those who have not gotten their snacks and their coffee or juice and water, please, you may go and get them at the lobby. Speech, Dean 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗶𝗃 of the Asian Center will introduce our welcome.
Magandang umaga po sa lahat. It is my pleasure to introduce to you the President of the University of the Philippines, who, among his other accomplishments, is responsible for adding service to the motto of the university. Angelo A. Jimenez is a labor lawyer and a respected authority on global worker migration whose work has contributed to the establishment of the Philippines' new Department of Migrant Workers, as well as the labor migration regulatory framework in countries in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. A former Deputy Administrator of the Overseas Workers Welfare Administration, Jimenez's expertise and experience in the field of migrant worker welfare have brought him to different parts of the world. He served as labor attaché in Japan, Kuwait, and Iraq. Former President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo awarded him citations for ensuring the safety of Filipino workers during the Israel-Lebanon conflict and for the rescue of a Filipino hostage held in Iraq. While at the Department of Labor and Employment, Jimenez represented the agency on the tripartite Industrial Peace Council, Governing Board on the Commission on Filipino Overseas, and the Interagency Media Task Force on Overseas Filipino Workers. At the Office of the President, he represented the Office of the Senior Deputy Executive Secretary in the Presidential Fact-Finding and Policy Advisory Commission on the Protection of Overseas Filipinos, better known as the 𝗍𝗀𝗃𝗀 Commission, and the Cabinet Committee on Maritime and Ocean Affairs during the administration of the late President 𝗍𝗹𝘁𝗍𝗀 Ramos. With his extensive background in labor migration, Jimenez has been tapped as an expert lecturer by the 𝗍𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗋 or International Training Center for Authorities and Leaders Philippines, where he has given lectures on gender-responsive migration governance, ethical recruitment principles, migrant protection, and crisis preparedness. He has also written papers for organizations such as the International Organization for Migration Philippines and the Blas Ople Policy Center, focusing on migration law and labor recruitment policies, processes, and practices. He is a regular lecturer on Philippine overseas labor laws at the UP Law Center's mandatory continuing legal education program. The global outlook of President Jimenez is not just a result of the work he accomplished overseas, but the education he received abroad. President Jimenez graduated with a Master in Public Management degree from the National University of Singapore's Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy and was a Lee Kuan Yew Fellow at the Harvard School of Government. His understanding of the factors that have led to the Filipino diaspora, on the other hand, is a product of his education and experiences in Butuan, Agusan del Norte, where he was born and raised, and in UP Diliman, where he obtained both his Bachelor of Laws and Bachelor of Arts in Sociology degrees. As a law student at UP Diliman, he was an associate editor of the Philippine Collegian and president of the College Editors Guild of the Philippines. He was also elected chairperson of the University Student Council and in 1992 was appointed student regent to the UP Board of Regents by the late President Corazon C. Aquino. He later rejoined the BOR when he was appointed regent by former President Rodrigo R. Duterte in 2016, during which he also served concurrently as trustee of the UP Foundation Incorporated. A son of Mindanao, President Jimenez believes that the Philippines' premier state university must be a hub for transformational change and that engaging communities and helping solve real-world problems should be part of the UP academic experience. Ultimately, The goal is for UP to become a global university that asks the consequential questions of our time and, acting locally, strives to address the serious issues confronting the country and the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us all welcome the University President, Attorney Angelo A. Jimenez.
Maayong buntag kaninyong tanan, and good morning to all our distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. I was very gratified to hear that at the Hybrid International Conference on the Asian-African Conference of 1955 and celebrating 𝗍𝗲𝗀, the Bandung spirit, because frankly, I was very worried about that spirit. I remember when I was in my early teens reading about Gamal Abdel Nasser and Sukarno, and I thought even then, in a very vague sense, remember I was in high school, maybe first year, second year high school, these are heroes. And this particular activity, reaffirming 𝗍𝗲𝗀 today, has added significance, particularly in the Philippines, in the light of the very intense geopolitical rivalry that could tend to drag our country into conflict, as it is threatening to do today. So I'm very happy for the University of the Philippines to be hosting this. On behalf of our academic community, I extend our warm greetings to our partners from De La Salle University, particularly the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, and to our very own UP Asian Center and UP Center for International Studies for bringing this extraordinary gathering to life today. Incidentally, my indigenous name is Dato Mancalagan. I am a member of the Manobo tribe of Agusan del Norte. But before I proceed, allow me to acknowledge our distinguished guests and speakers joining us today. Ms. Ita Nadia, ma'am, founder of the National Commission on Violence Against Women in Indonesia. Dr. Syed Farid Alatas, professor at the National University of Singapore. May I? Thank you, sir. I am an alumnus of the NUS, sir, from the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. And welcome to UP Diliman. Dr. Vanessa Herman, senior lecturer at the Curtin University, Perth, Western Australia. Thank you for being here. I love your little city. I attended a conference, a 3-day conference last year at Perth, and every day I would walk up 20 minutes to Kings Park and walk that Aboriginal trail every day, starting at 5:30, and the meeting would start at 9. I think Dr. Moratilla was there with me at that time. He was not yet the dean then. Dr. Wildan Sina Utama, lecturer at the History Department of the Universitas Gadjah Mada. Welcome, sir. Dr. Fernando Santiago, Jr., Director of the DLSU Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. Thank you, sir. Dr. Vladimeir Gonzales, Director of Likhaan, UP Institute of Creative Writing. Okay. Dr. Noel Moratilla, Dean of the UP Asian Center. And Dr. Ramon Guillermo, Head of the UP Center for International Studies. Momen was a colleague of mine way back in our students writing for the Philippine Collegian. Your presence honors and affirms the enduring ties that link our universities, our nations, and our people. 70 years ago, in 1955, the Bandung Conference declared that the newly independent nations of Asia and Africa by the colonial power or Cold War polarization, then raging. I remember that was the time of the Suez Crisis when Egypt nationalized the Suez Canal. Instead, they would define themselves through solidarity, sovereignty, and shared commitment to justice and peace. That vision, born in Bandung, was at that time bold and audacious. It insisted that the moral and political agency of peoples, long considered peripheral, must take center stage. It reimagined the world not as a hierarchy, but as a community of equals. That was very daring during the time. And it called upon us, scholars, leaders, and citizens, to recognize that dignity and independence are not gifts of the powerful, but achievements of solidarity and struggle. Today, as we celebrate 70 years of the Bandung spirit, we find ourselves once again in a world struggling with inequality, maybe even worse now, environmental collapse, and resurgent imperial ambitions. But we also find ourselves in a time of extraordinary possibility, a time when the global South, rather a vague term for me today, speaking in many voices, is reclaiming its power to imagine and to act. In this sense, the spirit of Bandung is not a memory to be enshrined. It is a mandate to be renewed. It is a moral imperative. 𝗍𝗲, to be one of spirit, reminds us that the task of liberation is never finished. It requires courage not only to resist domination, but to create new forms of cooperation, grounded in empathy and equality. It requires that we listen to each other across borders and discipline, and apparently this is not a very easy thing to do, however simple it sounds, simply to listen to each other. And that we allow scholarship, art, and activism to speak to one another, and that we sustain the difficult but vital work of imagining and reimagining the world anew. Here at the University of the Philippines, we embrace this task as part of our public mission. Our university was born from the same historical moment of anti-colonial struggle and has, for over a century, sought to educate citizens who will be capable of critical thought, moral courage, and service to the people. The Bandung legacy and its insistence on intellectual independence and, even harder, moral clarity remains at the heart of what we strive to do as the national university. Particularly now when swirls of moral ambiguities hover above our heads. As we welcome you to UP Diliman for the third day of 𝗍𝗲, the Spirit of Bandung at 70, I hope you will find here not only space for rigorous discussion, but also a community of shared purpose. May the dialogues that begin in these halls ripple outward across campuses, countries, and even generations to inspire new solidarities, strengthen old ones, new collaborations, and new acts of imagination. 70 years ago, the leaders and thinkers of Bandung asked, what does it mean to be free? Together. Today, we might ask, what must we do to stay free together? Let this conference be one that answers that question. Welcome to the University of the Philippines. Welcome to the continuing Spirit of Bandung. Daghang salamat. Thank you very much, and maayong buntag sa atin.
Proceed to our second keynote lecture, which will be delivered online. Our keynote speaker is Professor Hilmar Farid, a senior fellow at Georgetown University. He is also a historian, cultural activist, and public intellectual whose work bridges scholarship, policy, and grassroots movements. He has long been active in intellectual networks such as Inter-Asia Cultural Studies and ARENA, advancing critical debates on decolonization, culture, and social justice in Southeast Asia. From 2016 to 2024, he served as Director General of Culture in Indonesia's Ministry of Education and Culture, where he championed cultural heritage, creative industries, and public history, while promoting community-based approaches to cultural life. He is currently teaching at the Graduate School of the Jakarta Institute of the Arts and is a senior fellow at Georgetown University, continuing to position culture as a vital arena for democracy, historical justice, and sustainable futures. Ladies and gentlemen, Professor Hilmar Farid with his keynote lecture, Legacies of Bandung, Reviving Connectivity, Regeneration, and Praxis.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction. Selamat pagi, good morning to all of you. Magandang umaga. President Jimenez, thank you for your thoughtful remarks. You've touched on some of the most pressing global issues of our time, from inequality and climate change to the challenges of rebuilding trust and solidarity across nations. That framing, and it sets a powerful tone for our discussion today. My thanks also to the organizers for bringing us together, and warm greetings to all participants joining this important conversation. And my special thanks to Ramon Bomen Guillermo. Kumusta ka? Bomen and I met 25 years ago when we were young, loud, and full of big ideas. Today, still loud and full of ideas, I suppose, but a little less young. But I'm grateful for our friendship then and now. Maraming salamat. I'm really sorry. Also see it as an invitation to go back to a time when we actually listened to the speaker closely without distractions. So we are here to mark 70 years since the 1955 Asian African Conference in Bandung. 1 week that changed how Indonesia and much of the world thought about itself and the world. And this year, we also celebrate the centenary of Pramoedya Ananta Toer, the writer and public intellectual who helped carry Bandung's spirit through his essays and literary writings. And Pramoedya was also part of the Asian African Writers Conference, which I will discuss a little bit later. So here's my plan. I want to talk about the Afro-Asian movement that grew from Bandung, especially the cultural side that often gets less attention. Wildan Sena Utama, who spoke earlier today, has already shown that the movement, in fact, left a big living archive behind it. Magazines, translations of books, tons of correspondence, films, and I think if we dust it off together, we can use it now in classrooms, studios, newsrooms, and festivals. In most commemorations of the Bandung 55 conference, people would present a famous photograph outside of Gedung Merdeka, where the leaders of the newly independent countries, Sukarno, Nasser, Nehru, Zhou Enlai, taking the historic walk from their hotel to the conference venue. And the street at that time was packed with people, like the image that I have in my background here. Ordinary Indonesians watching the leaders of the Third World on their way to the important conference, announcing themselves to the world. But in this talk, I want to invite you to widen that frame. Imagine the conference as the opening chapter of a much longer story, where literary editors argued over translations in the Writers' Bureau office in Cairo, for example, or where poets traded drafts at the 1958 conference in Tashkent, or where journalists invented a non-aligned way to tell the news at that time, or where festival organizers spliced reels in Jakarta at the Asian African Film Festival in 1964. So what I want to highlight here is that Bandung was not only a diplomatic event, but also the start of a cultural infrastructure, a network built by writers, translators, critics, filmmakers, and reporters who decided solidarity needed its own languages, its own magazines, and its own circuits. And that collective decision is the reason why Bandung lives on well beyond the 1955 conference communique. So what changed in 1955 wasn't simply geopolitical alignment. Bandung made a philosophical wager that the universal, or in this regard, the idea of the human, with its long history, could be spoken from the South in many voices and still be universal. It paired non-alignment with a kind of anti-colonial humanism. So we think of 𝗍𝗍𝗂𝗍, for example, his line about a humanism made to the measure of the world. And Bandung gave these kinds of ideas a stage and made it actionable. For artists and intellectuals, it opened a space to speak to one another as equals across the Cold War divide. And that's why Bandung matters to the arts, literature, and to culture. It invited a new grammar for world making, not as a theory alone, but as practice. And one of the sharpest readers of this shift was Richard Wright, the African-American novelist, poet, and essayist. He came to Indonesia during that conference as a journalist. He watched the sessions of the Bandung conference, he spoke with the people, and wrote The Color Curtain, an excellent record, not only of the conference, but also about cultural life in newly independent Indonesia. So Wright wrote of Bandung as a form of anti-colonial cosmopolitanism, an attempt to work together beyond the Iron Curtain by naming a different fault line, the color curtain of colonial racism. And what makes Wright useful for us today is that he doesn't only describe statecraft, he reads Bandung as a cultural problem about like how to imagine a shared human horizon after empire and how art and ideas might travel to make that horizon real. And here in Indonesia, Wright's visit wasn't simply a celebrity stopover. His visit triggered interviews, columns, disagreements, debates, and it pulled Indonesian modernists at the time into a live dialogue with a Black Atlantic intellectual in a very specific moment of our literary life. There's this interesting book titled Indonesian Notebook, which reconstructs these cross currents and shows the Bandung as a two-way traffic. Indonesian debates shaping global conversations, even as global debates reshape us. And that reciprocity of reading, translating, and disputing is the Bandung method at ground level. So if the Bandung lit a spark, writers built the circuits to carry it. And within a couple of years after the conference, the Afro-Asian People Solidarity Organization helped midwife the Afro-Asian Writers Bureau, and with its first permanent headquarters in Colombo, Sri Lanka. And the secretary of the organization is 𝗍𝗍𝗶𝘃 Setiawan, whose spouse Nadia is also attending this conference. And I saw her just now taking photographs with all of you. So the aims of the Bureau, the Writers Bureau, were practical. It was to convene meetings, compile anthologies, start the journals, exchange translations, and basically to treat literature as part of decolonization's everyday work. And across early gatherings from Colombo to Tashkent to Cairo, writers argued openly about aesthetics and politics. Who is the audience? Which language carries which history? And when we say that art must serve the people, what do we actually mean by it? So this is a time where combat literature hardened into a program, not sloganeering, but writing answerable to living struggles. And there's a large archive about this discussion, some of which was covered in reports on the conference in Tashkent. I visited Tashkent a few years ago. I went to the building where the conference was held. And in the local archives, there are fascinating material, photos, including one showing Pramoedya and Utu Tatang Sultani from Indonesia attending the conference. And I think it's definitely worth visiting if you get the chance to do that. But however, like all ambitious projects at that time, which were born in a storm, the Bureau, the Writers' Bureau, also met the weather of the Cold War. In 1966, the Sino-Soviet split fractured the movement. Beijing started a new literary journal called The Call, while and it was published until 1991 or so, I think. While the Cairo-based Permanent Bureau launched an anthology titled Afro-Asian Writings, 2 volumes of that, and also the journal Lotus in 1968. But the journal also ceased publication in the early 90s. And I think this has something to do with the end of the Cold War and so on. So we could see during that period that the rhetoric sharpened, but the organizational map also changed. But if we take a step back, then a steadier picture would emerge that the practices that matter most, translation, convening, publishing, actually kept going. And that the infrastructure also helped, even under ideological stress. And that continuity is why so many of the best colonial debates of the 1970s and 1980s happened in around Lotus. But it's quite strange. And if you look at the post-colonial studies that we know today, they have made so little use of this archive. So let's dive a bit deeper into the journal Lotus, which I would say functioned as a public square for the decolonizing world. It published long essays on aesthetics, on language politics, dossiers on Vietnam and Palestine, arguments about audience and form, and also it organized an annual Lotus Prize with explicit criteria which honor works of high artistic value, which would oppose racism, of course, and imperialism and voice people's aspirations. And the laureates of that, including Mahmoud Darwish of Palestine, 𝗪𝗪𝗀𝗪 Bationgo, among them, it shows how seriously the journal took language choice, translation, and the ethics of address. Lotus turned solidarity into editorial labor and prized culture. They built a canon that didn't need to pass through Paris or London to count as world literature. So that was the contribution, I think, from that journal. So let's turn now to Pramoedya Ananta Toer. Pramoedya is often read as a national novelist, and rightly so, yeah? But in the life of Bandung, he's also a transnational delegate and an institution builder. In 1958, he traveled with Indonesia's delegation to the Asian African Writers' Conference in Tashkent, deepening his engagement with a global anti-imperialist community of writers and sharpening his sense that Indonesia's revolution was unfinished and that literature had work to do in finishing it. So he didn't become political in a sudden turn. He became more deliberate about how writing could connect Indonesian experience to an Afro-Asian horizon. And when he got back Indonesia, early 1960s, he found a lever, Lentera, or the Lantern, which was the cultural supplement of Bintang Timur, the Eastern Star, the radical nationalist newspaper published in the 1960s. As the editor of the publication, he turned the slogan, "Art in Service of the People," into an editorial program, where he published work that kept class, poverty, and anti-imperialism in view, and arguing, often bluntly, with those who preferred artistic autonomy. So what everyone thinks of that stance, it names a serious question Bandung actually forced upon us. What kind of art helps build a post-colonial society, and how would we know? So equally important to that, Pramoedya also insisted that Bandung's humanism apply at home. In 1960, he wrote 𝗪𝗪𝗪𝗪 di Indonesia, where he defended Chinese Indonesians against racial exclusion and argued for a republic that did not reproduce the hierarchies it opposed. So the book was promptly banned by the military, but it remains a key artifact linking Bandung's global ethic to Indonesia's domestic struggles over belonging. And as we know, he was arrested in October 1965 during the anti-communist violence and the destruction of the cultural networks. And of course, it silenced much of his work, but the line is still there, that the writer as delegate, editor as organizer, and literature as public institution. And I think we need to pay serious attention to all these like materials, the papers, magazines, and clippings, the stubborn material that holds the memory of Bandung together. So that Bandung is not only remembered as the venue of an international conference in the civics textbook, but Bandung is, we should think of Bandung also as a box of lotus issues with a torn cover, a folder of Indonesian press columns about Richard Wright's visit, film festival poster from Jakarta in 1964, and so on. So if we gather these pieces and describe them well, the story starts to breathe again. And we don't have to start from zero. For Bandung itself, we have rich documentation, including early reporting and reception. And I think the book that I mentioned, the Indonesian Notebook, the source book, is a reminder that Indonesia did not simply receive international guests, global leaders, and global writers, but Indonesian editors and readers also actively shaped the encounter with interviews, debates, and lectures. So that's a model of reciprocity worth rebuilding. So for the writers' movements, we have the Afro-Asian Writers' Bureau Trail, early conference proceedings, the two poetry anthologies that I mentioned before, and the journals that anchor the network, the Beijing's The Paul, and also Cairo's Lotus. And these are not just primary sources. They are proof that translation, anthologizing, and public argument were the method of Afro-Asian solidarity. And notice the journal gives us a functioning public sphere from the 1970s and 80s. And I think if you look at the recognition of writers like Mahmoud Darwish, Mugi Wationgo, it actually kept Bandung's ethical edge in literary form. On the Indonesian side, we have Pramoedya Tashkent's phrase, and crucially his 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗏 years, where the principle of art serving the people became an editorial practice. And of course, his book on the Chinese Indonesian also linked Bandung's humanism to the fight against racism at home. And these materials let us reinsert Indonesia as a hinge, not a margin in the Afro-Asian story. But there are two shadows that I think fall across this field. First is the loss of credit and context through translation. So much of the Afro-Asian corpus moved across English, French, Arabic, Russian, Hindu, Indonesian too, and often the translator vanished in the process. And early anthologies were also criticized for uneven quality and haphazard compilation. The launch of the Lotus, for example, was in part an attempt to repair that record with clearer editorial standards. But even then, translator names, source languages, and editorial choices often went unrecorded. And I think without those, we cannot track how ideas actually traveled or who enabled them. So that's one concern. And secondly, Indonesia was silent after 1965. The anti-communist silence did not only remove people, it also dismantled institutions, presses, supplements, network, and so on, and scattered collections. So reassembling 𝗩𝗏𝗀𝗏𝗏, all these like initiatives of the 1950s and 1960s, including Tashkent correspondence, isn't just an attempt to fill back the shelves. It's stitching back a broken continuity in how Indonesia spoke to Asia and Africa. And we can add to that the Beijing-Cairo split in the writers' movement, the core versus the Lotus. And you get competing universals and partial archives. So the bureaucratic residue is uneven, but the rhetoric is polemical. And because both sides kept the practical work of translation, convening, and publishing going, there is enough, if you organize it carefully, of course, to rebuild a usable past. So what do we do? How do we go about this? And right now, I can see three tracks that reinforce each other. So track one is about archive and description. We can start where the connective tissues is thickest. I would say the journals Lotus and the Call, yeah, the Indonesian press dossiers from the Bandung Conference up to 1965, during which the Afro-Asian Journalists Association, writers, women organizations, ministerial meetings and conferences, also film festivals took place. Yeah. And let's get a bit more practical about this. For each item, we can create, for example, a clean bilingual metadata, Indonesian and English first, then add Arabic, French, Swahili, Hindi as partners to join. And you can easily do that with today's technology. But what is very important are that the translator and editor credits are non-negotiable. We should avoid invisible labor. We should bring that to light. Yeah, and cross-indexing would help, for example, a student to click from a Lotus essay to its Indonesian reception, or from a Lentera column to a call piece on the same debate. So that's how I think the circuits become visible again. Yeah, so that's track one. Track two. Translation as our operating system. And Vildan has already mentioned this in his presentation earlier this morning, and I know Bob and Guillermo also has done extensive research about this subject. So we should think of translation as Bandung's method, not a service. Yeah? So we can commission, for example, a slim two-way portfolios that pair a historic Afro-Asian text with a contemporary response, for example. Poems with criticism, political essays with linguistics and film notes, and publish them online under a clear credited translator policy. Yeah, so this answers, I think, the asymmetries the movement itself wrestled with, and turns the archive into a living classroom. So that's track two. Sorry. So track three, public pedagogy. So we can bundle the archive that I mentioned before into some kind of like a Bandung reader module. No, short teachable text for schools, campuses, and also reading groups. No, one module on combat literature, for example, using the Afro-African Writers Bureau anthologies, or another on a language on politics, probably around 𝗩𝗍𝗀𝗃's debate in Lotus and Pramoedya's own piece about language in Indonesia, and so on. So teaching with this material ensures that this is not nostalgia, but really equipment. Yeah, and we can add to that several other ideas. For example, what I have in mind right now is like residences and an assembly. Yeah, we can launch programs for editors and translators and residents, rotating Africa, Asia, Bandung, Jakarta, Cairo, Nairobi, and so on, to rebuild the editorial networks that once sustained all these like initiatives. And right now we have, I'm part of that, like a group of scholar activists who are working on this, who wanted to place Bandung back at the crossroads and signal that the circuits are actually open. So, and let us let the tone of this work be more straightforward and generous. We should name the ruptures without turning them into destiny. We certainly need to credit translators, cite the editors, and respect the contested parts of the record, like the Beijing-Cairo split, not to litigate and postpone, but to understand how competing universal claims are fought through journals and anthologies, and how the practical labor of translation, convening, publishing kept the bridge open. So that's the ethic, I think, to carry into the next phase. So let me now end where we began. Bandung was never only a community. Yeah, it was a method for making a world, translating to know each other, archiving to remember together, and exchange to act together. So Richard Wright once described Bandung as a wager on a broader humanism, an anti-colonial cosmopolitanism in practice. And Pramoedya lived that wager at home, on the page, in the newsroom, on the conference floor, insisting that literature answers the realities of people's lives, and that the Republic, the Indonesian Republic, reject racism in all its forms. So the invitation today is simple to say, but demanding to do, yeah, to help rebuild the circuits. So let's bring a text to translate bring a family archive to scan, bring a class to co-teach, and bring a film to restore. The point is not to memorialize Bandung. The point is to continue it. So thank you, maraming salamat sa pakikinig. Thank you for listening, dan terima kasih.
Thank you, Professor Hilmar Farid, for your insights and perspectives, especially your perspectives on carrying the Bandung legacy to the future. So we now invite our reactors to provide their reflections and share their perspectives. Before that, let me introduce to you the moderator of this session. A member of the faculty of the Department of English and Comparative Literature, also an Umali just like me, but a much younger one. May I introduce to you Lakan Umali.
Hello. Okay, thank you so much, Professor Umali. Thank you to everyone who's attending today's event and will listen to our discussion today. The 𝗩𝗶𝘀𝗀 University of the Philippines Institute of Creative Writing, 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗶𝗋, in partnership with the UP Center for International Studies and UP Asian Center, is proud to hold the 2025 Asian Literary Forum today at the GT Toyota Asian Center Auditorium, which is part of the 4-day 2025 Bandung Conference with the theme 𝗩𝗶𝘁𝗀, the Spirit of Bandung at 𝗍𝗀. So this forum is specifically called A Conversation with Dr. Hilmar Farid on Pramoedya Ananta Toer's Centenary. So I will introduce the two reactors to Professor Farid's discussion. First, we have Professor Anthony G. Mendoza III. He is an assistant professor of literature and creative writing at the University of the Philippines, Diliman. His research and creative works have appeared in American Historical Review, Southeast Asian Studies, or 𝗍𝗫𝗍𝗍, Kyoto University, UNITAS, The Dial, World Literature Today, Asian Books Blog, and Anomaly Magazine. He is the co-editor of 𝗍𝗲𝗱𝗏, Best Contemporary Stories in Translation from the Philippines, published by 𝗩𝗲𝗏𝘁 Press in 2021, and Destination Southeast Asia 2050 AD, published by Penguin Random House Southeast Asia 2022. He has translated the works of Eka Corneawan, Shairil Anwar, and Luigi Tucul into Filipino. His translated collection of Eka Corneawan short fiction, Mga Himutok sa Palikuran, published by Savage Mind in 2021, was named Best Translated Book at the 40th National Book Awards. Let's give a round of applause to Professor Mendoza. Our second reactor for today's event is Dr. Vladimeir Gonzales. Dr. Vladimeir Gonzales, siya po ay isang propesor sa Universidad ng Pilipinas kung saan siya ay nagtuturo ng malikhaing pagsulat, panitikan at kulturang popular. Nakapaglimbag siya ng 2 libro sa Miraflores Publishing House, isang napakalaking kaistigan at A-side, B-side, ang mga piso sa jukebox ng buhay mo. Inilimbag naman ng University of Philippines Press ang kanyang mga librong lab, mag-aadaptasyon at iba pang laro para sa mga klaseng panlaboratorio. Mga tala ng isang superfan, fan poetry at fan fiction, at sa kanto ng makabud at mangga, mga eskwela. Ang interes, malikhaing produksyon at mga pag-aaral niya ay nakatutok sa pagsasalin, fan studies, video games at dula. Makikita ang kanyang mga sulatin at larawan sa kanyang website na vladgonzales.net. Muli, a round of applause for Professor Gonzales. Okay.
Good morning, everyone. Selamat pagi. Thank you, Professor Farid, Dr. Farid, for the very insightful and super detailed lecture. Lots of things to take on. But I guess to jumpstart the discussion, I want to underscore this idea that he mentioned about translation as a method. Because personally, as a translator, I also believe that translation was not only a method, but is a constitutive process for many intellectuals during the post-war period. So not only literally translating literary texts, but actually translating ideas. So for instance, the 1950s, the 1960s was a time when many writers and many cultural organizations, not only in Southeast Asia, but in Africa, Latin America, and all parts of the newly emerging world, were dealing with ideas and concepts like socialist realism and many of the isms of that time. So I was happy that Professor Farid highlighted translation not only as a method, because I see it as a very important and constitutive process. While I wouldn't necessarily style myself as a Pramoedya expert, I do work on Indonesian literature, and for the most part, I also share his sentiment that while he is commonly received, or at least he is commonly regarded as a national writer, I always saw him as someone who has a very transnational vision. And I think one work that underscores that is his Realisme Sosialis dan Sastra Indonesia, or Socialist Realism in Indonesian Literature. And in that work, and in keeping with the theme of this conference, Pramoedya underscored, at least in that work, the idea that socialist realism isn't necessarily something that is to be imported from the Soviet Union, but is something that is the province or the preserve of all oppressed people. So to be able to express the struggle of all oppressed people, including not only in the Indonesian people, but all the people from former colonies, he argues that socialist realism was at least one of the most important ways, at least, to express that kind of struggle. So in that way, by particularizing, or for the lack of a better term, provincializing socialist realism, he was kind of affirming its very universality. So in that sense, I always regarded Pramoedya not as this national writer who wrote the Buru Quartet, although the Buru Quartet was very important in its very own way, especially during the late 1980s and 1990s for pro-democracy activists in Indonesia, using the book as some sort of a way to understand the workings of the mind of state forces in order to avoid underscored Pramoedya as this transnational cosmopolitan writer, because for the most part, critics do ignore, or at least don't really highly regard his works from the 1950s and early 1960s, due to the fact that it was a time that he was really active with LECRA and with the Communist Party of Indonesia. So I guess I'll stop here, and maybe later I'll drop some more points for the Q&A, and yeah, so that Professor Vladimeir Gonzales has the time to share.
Parang kami ay Arts Management Office, Arts Events Office. So we do literature-based events and publications. At yung appreciation and pag-process ko ng talk ngayon ay base dun sa aking pinanggagalingang opisina. So I'm from the UP Institute of Creative Writing. Our archives, our history give details that the Institute's roots can be connected to the 1975 Afro-Asian Conference, from which then President Ferdinand Marcos, medyo Marcos pala kami na nag-umpisa, announced the establishment of a creative writing center at the University of the Philippines. The stated goal was to expose young and aspiring writers, not only to experienced writers, but also to their Afro-Asian counterparts. The actual legwork, though, in materializing the center was initiated and formalized by national artist for theater 𝗩𝗲𝗂𝗶𝘶 who sent the official proposal in establishing the Creative Writing Center to UP President 𝗩𝗲𝗂𝗂𝗃𝗃. The center was approved by UP's Board of Regents on December 7, 1978. The UP ICW's original design in history, a government office facing an alternative world stage amidst an emerging Philippine dictatorship, working within and around institutional patronage and bureaucracies. This can be viewed as the institute's situation as well as the general political and creative landscape of arts and literature that each of its founding and succeeding members have to engage and contend with to literature and arts-related programs. We have the usual challenges: curricular reforms, budget constraints, working with university and government administrators. As administrations change, the roster, comprised of published and awarded teacher writers in UP, adjust, adapt, collaborate, and coordinate to produce publications and events that articulate the sentiments of the time, of each time, I guess. UP and ICW at its core embody a critical and progressive stance as it moves within the confines of institutions. Its flagship projects, the Lakan Journal and the UP National Writers Workshop, have produced writers, scholars, and creatives that have been known to participate in campaigns that champion free expression, safe spaces, and a general better world. This world should represent sectors that are not dominantly represented in media, academia, and other ideological dwellings. A world free from oppression, resisting to be defined by colonial rule, a just, peaceful world. In the last 5 years, hindi ko po kaya ikwento yung buong history, pero in the last 5 years of the Lakan UP ICW, we have launched various fora, interviews, publications, and performances that engage, for example, the Duterte regime in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, extrajudicial arrests and summary executions of artists and progressive leaders, martial law under Ferdinand Marcos and its revivals or manifestations or variations in contemporary time, writing for children, women, and LGBTQIA++, translation, sinabi din kanina, and adaptation work that focus on literature from the Philippine regions, and other literature-based activities that feature the emancipatory potential of literature and the arts. Since 2022 until present, I'm happy to inform you that we have included the Asian Literary Forum, a project designed to highlight issues and struggles of Asian nations as articulated by its literature and creative writing projects. To date, we have featured writers and scholars from Japan, Korea, Malaysia, and Indonesia with the latest discussion on the 100 years of Pramoedya Ananta Toer. These are small steps in further realizing the vision declared in Bandung 70 years ago: solidarity, sovereignty, respect, peace, justice. I have to agree with Dr. Hilmar Farid that we can improve on developing more archiving projects that will gather our literary and creative history. So kulang pa tayo dyan sa pagtatago ng kasaysayan ng ating malikhaing produksyon. Lastly, creative spaces are spaces of struggle and contention. Our institute understands this and continuously find ways to work with institutional and personal constraints as we forge further alliances and collaborations. Recently, we launched a forum, last June, we launched a forum on the Palestinian-led boycott of the Frankfurt Book Fair. The process to initiate this project was challenging as we are again faced with how to articulate and process our differing ideas of a world stage. It even sparked debates within our ranks as well as the general Philippine creative writing community months after the actual forum. Despite the potential divisiveness of crucial issues that affect Asia and the world, I believe that it is necessary to pursue discussions and initiatives to feature stories that are deliberately and violently erased by global powers. Our participation in the 𝗪𝗔𝗪 conference and other related activities is our commitment in fighting for creative institutions that constantly seek the disenfranchised and provide spaces to articulate their narratives. In solidarity, we persist. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Mendoza and Professor Gonzales, for the productive engagements with Pramoedya Ananta Toer's work, as well as the discussion on the entanglements of creative writing and its adjacent institutions in the Philippines. At this point, I think we can open the floor for the open forum. May I also call Dr. 𝗍𝗀𝗀𝗃 to be a part of the Q&A so that we can merge the question and answer for the two keynote lectures this morning, as well as the responses of Professor Mendoza and Professor Gonzales. So can we please get a chair for Professor 𝗍𝗀𝗀𝗃? So at this point, are there any questions for Professor 𝗍𝗀𝗃, Professor Farid, Professor Mendoza, or Professor Gonzales? You may approach. Is there a microphone there? Yes, you may call one of the very helpful administrative staff for a microphone. Please introduce yourself and state your question, as well as whoever this question is addressed to. The mic is over there, right? Yes, please. Yes, Professor? Okay.
Thank you very much. My question is for Dr. 𝗍𝗀𝗀𝗃. Yeah, 𝗍𝗀𝗀𝗃. I think it also, the question can also apply to Hilmar Farid. I want to ask a critical comment about Bandung, the conference. Pak Wildan, you were talking about symbolic intervention, yeah? I'm wondering whether it was just symbolic. See, when you say symbolic, we mean it's an expression of some intention or feeling, which doesn't necessarily lead. So was it symbolic in the sense that there was an expression of certain feelings, certain views, which led to other symbolic interventions, other Asia, Africa, Afro-Asia conferences? It seems that the interest in digitization of knowledge was never taken up by any of these governments. On the contrary, they pushed us into deeper and deeper into cultural imperialism, academic dependency. The ministries of education, signed or the global ranking system, and so on and so forth. So, and the decolonization is taken seriously by academics, by activists, by NGOs, not by the states. So were they really interested in this from the beginning? It seems like after the conference was over, they forgot about it. So how do we talk about this? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Alatas. It's a really important questions, as well as difficult. But I understand they prepare the symbolical moment in Bandung is not only just a cultural, like a showing to the world that they were united like that, but it's also, I think it can be both. It's a sense of expressions and also a symbolic interventions, in my view. A sense of expressions that they prepare that the cultural diplomacy to giving a sense of trying to understand each other. So Bandung actually making friendship at the forefront, at the foreground, because there is no solidarity without friendship. friendship is the bedrock of the foundations of solidarity. Bandung thought that in 1955 because the first aim of the conference is to getting know each other. So that's also always, what is that, reveal in the Afro-Asian movements themselves, putting friendship first before solidarity, because without friendship relationships, you cannot build solidarity. So there is a sense of expressions that we should build friendship, we should build connections, we should build cooperations, because there is no unity without friendship, without connections, without cooperations. And also they also wants to giving what is that, a sense of expressions to the meaning to the words that they what is that, trying to walking each others together to taking stance in the global issue. That's why they have freedom walk. I think it's not only just, what is that, making closer the leaders to the publics, but there's symbolic interventions to what is that, showing the words that they trying to working side by side, even though there is a tough contestations within the Bandung, but they're trying at least to taking a stand to the global issues that becoming concern for them. But yeah, that's also related to the symbolic interventions, because that's the message is they want to show that this is our method, the solidarity cooperation, our methods of anti-colonial solidarity. So in my perspectives, perhaps it can be both understood as a sense of expressions, but also symbolic interventions. I hope it answers that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Utama. Would any of our panelists like to add? Dr. Farid? Dr. Farid, I think you're muted.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thank you. Professor Alatas, thank you very much for the questions. And I think you're right to press this. Yeah. I do believe that Bandung was a powerful symbolic intervention. But as we know, symbols without institutions can evaporate. No? As you pointed out, like many national leaders after the conference did return to business as usual, yeah? And the global order stayed imperial in structure, so to say. But I think it's important for us to also name the political shock that followed 1955, which was the authoritarian turn of the 1960s and 70s. Indonesia, of course, 1965-66, the anti-communist violence, not only dismantled unions, cultural organizations, press, journals, and so on. So a whole, let's say, editorial ecosystem was shattered. No, Pramoedya, along with like hundreds of other writers, were jailed, exiled, or silenced. No, and the regional ecos is also important. A similar tightening happened at the same time in Malaysia. In Singapore, yeah, the tensions, press controls, campus curbs, and so on. In the Philippines, martial law reconfigured media and the arts. And it also had like a global resonance. There was this book like Vincent Davis entitled The Jakarta Method, in which he says basically that 1965 became a template. And its logic reappeared in Chile in 1973. It was even called Operation Jakarta at the time. And across a wave of military dictatorships in Latin America and Africa. So this matters, I think, for your question, because it explains why Bandung's promise seemed to revert. It wasn't just an elite drift. It was active repression that broke that bridges. No? Newsrooms, publishing houses, translator circles that Bandung actually helped to build. But even so, I think Bandung's symbolism seeded infrastructures that outlasted the crackdowns. the movement building, the non-aligned, the Afro-Asian People Solidarity Organization, which created calendars, secretariats, working groups that fed into projects like the new International Economic Order in the 1970s. Not to mention the cultural secrets. The Afro-Asian Writers Bureau survived until the early 1990s, and so on. While many leaders reverted, but some of them stayed. And the symbolic, I think, here opened lanes others could actually drove on. Yeah, sometimes around their leaders, sometimes despite them. But yeah, I think it's for us very important to locate the entire trajectory of Bandung into its historical context here to get a much richer or nuanced understanding of it. Yeah, so yeah, that would be my response. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farid, for the historical contextualization and expansion on the discussion today. Do we have any follow-up questions or further questions for our panelists? Yes, please. No one in the back?
Good morning to our speakers. I am a student of UP in Philippine Studies. My question is for any one of the speakers. It was mentioned earlier about literature, and I want to ask, as someone who's interested, is there any larger effort towards translating these literature within each other's countries in a form of cultural exchange? And if there are, is there any effort or is there any way to make sure that these literature are read by each other's countries, especially as most of these countries are from former colonized countries? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Otama.
In Tashkent, the translations becoming the important method for promoting their identity, promoting the solidarity. So in Tashkent, there are exhibitions about Asians and Africans literatures, not only the classical one, but also the contemporary ones on that period, like the works of Pramoedya Ananta Toer, the short stories, Cerita dari Blora, if I'm not mistaken, was translated into Russian. So some of the major literatures works from Asia and Africa, Tagore also including that, was translated into Russians and exhibited in the Tashkent conference. So this is to show that we have a large traditions of the classical and the contemporary Asian Africans literatures. But also after that, they make it not only as exhibitions, but also as promoting their ideas, you know, and also showing to the world that what is canon, not only in the minds of the Western literatures, because Western literature also conceptualize what is canon from the former colonies, but they trying to digging into their traditions, that this is our rich traditions, our rich literary traditions. So one of the main programs also Hilmar Farid also mentions that they making that as main programs. So they tried to making an anthology of Afro-Asian poems from African and Asian writers across Asia and Africa. They already published 2 volumes in 1963 and also promoted in Bali Afro-Asians meetings in 1963. So there are poems like from Patrice Lumumba, from Ho Chi Minh, from other writers. They collected that. But also the most interesting for me also, the initiative to translate their works and also other works coming from the national cultural movement itself. Like in Indonesia, they tried to translate several works from Asian and African writers, like from Sudan, from other parts of Asia and Africa, and they also translate their work about Afro-Asian solidarity, about national struggle, national liberations across Asia and Africa into English. So the collections of poetry that I saw in my presentations, they originally from Bahasa Indonesia, Indonesian language. And there is a translator called Bintang Suradi from Lekra, the cultural activist organizations that was affiliated to the Communist Party. He became the translator to the every collections of poetry from Indonesian writers. Like we all are Lumumba is from the is from the Harian Rakyat, the Indonesian Communist Party newspapers that publish poetry about showing solidarity, about response to the Lumumba assassinations, and also the Indonesian sings of for us Afro-Asia is also collections in that newspapers, and they tried to translate that to show to the to their fellow in Asia and Africa what they do. So they brings that collections of poetry to the meetings, not only meetings of Afro-Asian writers, but also to the other Afro-Asian movements. So that's they did in that period.
Thank you so much, Dr. Utama. Dr. Farid, would you like to add anything?
Yes. Thank you very much for the question. It's a great question. And the short answer to that is yes. There's a history to stand on, and there's also fresh energy right now. In the 80s and 90s, Indonesia had a real momentum, actually. If you are familiar with Yayasan Obor, the Obor Foundation, it had a third world literature series, which brought voices from across the global south into Indonesia. There was also Yayasan Lontar, which helped move Indonesian writing into English. So these efforts proved at least two things. No? Like cross-border translation is doable, and readers will show up when the books are findable and also teachable. Of course, now today, situation is quite different. Yeah, but we are seeing a younger and cross-border projects. What I have in mind is like southeast of now. It's a very interesting online journal, and it's a good example on the art and ideas side. But yeah, of course, translation is only half the job. Yeah? The other half is making sure the book is actually read, yeah, dibaca, as you pointed out. And that means like co-editions and open access centers should be part of this. Yeah, we can create simple teaching packs, so a poem or essay jumps from page to classroom. And there are live circuits as well. Yeah, we can think of a translation, travels to Manila, Jakarta, KL, Singapore, instead of dying after one event. And if you want to, also to respond to Dr. Vladimeir before, if you want something real, we can actually start tomorrow. Yeah, let's do, for example, Lakan Indonesian pilot folio. Yeah, where one classic text in translation plus new Filipino Indonesian responses, all the translated and also, of course, published open access. Yeah, so we can pair that with a translation studio initiatives like that. So yeah, what I'm saying is that there are larger efforts, old and new. And our task now is to stitch them into steady circuits. Yeah, so translations don't just exist, but they actually circulate.
Yeah. Kwento niyo ako sa aming office. Well, bago yon yung there's this office, Centro ng Wikang Filipino, Center for Filipino Language, a UP-based office that I think around 90s, early 2000 They released a series of translations in Filipino of Asian literary writers. Hindi na lang natutuloy. I think during the pandemic, they made some of the titles open access. Hindi na ako sure ngayon. So that's the problem, I guess. Post-COVID, most of the materials that were open access then, they began restricting it again for purchase. So something that we have to address. In the case of the UP Institute of Creative Writing, we launched in 2021 the Philippine Translator Series. However, this series focuses on regional literature, so literature written in regional languages of the Philippines, translated to English or Filipino. Our main problem these days, we don't get much submissions. It is easier to get submissions of original works, so we have a Philippine Writer Series, mas madali doon. So in terms of publishing books in the Translator Series, I think we used up all the submissions, so we have still slots. So kung may kilala kayo actually na nasa regional languages na gusto mag-publish ng book, we have initial discussions on publishing books from Asian writers, but it has not materialized yet. So in terms of challenges, one challenge of course is dissemination. Usually we do conferences, activities, but it's restricted to school-to-school interactions. So we have much work in terms of moving outside the schools, going into the communities, having the materials read by our actual beneficiaries. So there's still much work to do in that department.
Thank you so much, Dr. Farid. Dr. Gonzales, Professor Mendoza, would you like to add anything?
Just to add some context to what Dr. Wildan and Dr. Farid had already mentioned. The efforts that were born out or that were the result of the networks formed after the Bandung conference, the effort to read, to translate, and understand each other is something that when read against the larger backdrop of the Cold War and then existing transnational organizations and cultural organizations that that aren't necessarily part of the Bandung network, I think what these works constitute is what Dr. Guillermo mentioned to be the Southern canon, or a canon that is outside existing or then dominant literary metropoles. So, for instance, you have the Afro-Asian anthologies, the Lotus anthologies, but then you also have book drives sponsored by USAID and the Franklin Book Program. You have book drives sponsored by the Congress for Cultural Freedoms. You have two different waves of attempts from different networks to make inroads in newly independent nations to at least affect the cultural scene and the intellectual scene of this nation. So, but the thing is, there's really a need to unearth and re-archive these works, because for the most part, what is known to us is the works and the remaining cultural traces of the book drives, the cultural initiatives initiated by organizations and institutions outside the Bandung network. So, yeah.
Thank you, Professor Mendoza. I think we have a question in the front. Yes, ma'am?
Thank you. Thanks very much, 𝗍𝗶𝘁. Selamat siang. I just have a question about, you mentioned dismantled institutions as a result of the 1965 killings, and restoring circuits of knowledge today is something that's really urgent for us to do. So I wanted to ask you, could we restore Indonesia into this picture, and what does it mean to restore Indonesia into the center of this story about Bandung? Because often Indonesia is often lost in the story of Bandung, in the Bandung spirit, and what happened to interrupt that Afro-Asian work that was done in Indonesia at that time. So, but what I mean is, how do we restore Indonesia into this picture, not in a sort of narrow nationalist way that our government is perhaps really intent on doing, but to restore Indonesia into this sort of, in an internationalist and anti-imperialist way, that so much of that has also been lost as a result of 1965. So how do we reclaim that history of struggle as part of the Indonesian story in that? And so the other question, which perhaps the other members of the panel might like to consider, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is to what extent, how do we actually read these works of literature? How do they date over time? I've read a lot of this Afro-Asian literature put out by different organisations. How do we contextualise them as to how they sit today and speak to new audiences? What are some of the tasks that need to be done to make these works of literature actually meaningful to new audiences?
Who would like to answer that question first among our panelists? Professor Wildan?
Alwas me. So my works for me is not only intellectual exercise, but I also, that's my struggle actually. But I don't intend to, what you mentioned, to restoring Indonesia positions in the world. That's a very big task for me. What I try to, with my works, to my students, to my academic community, to my society, is to giving back the sense that Indonesia is part of the world. That's the sense is lost now. Like we are the part of the global south, because now the government's trying to rebuild the image that we are the great civilizations. We are equal to the advanced countries. No, it's not. We are still poor, you know. Our position is still within the line of the global south. So I'm trying to giving a sense that we are not only the Indonesian governments, but also the most important thing, the people, is part of the world. We are citizens of the world. We have very rich, very vibrant histories in the 1950s and 1960s that prove that international activism, peace activism, decolonization activism is not belong to the state, but to the society. That's the sense that lost now to the imaginations of the Indonesians younger. That's becoming impetus for me to raise the awareness that we are not the spectators of the world. We are citizens of the world. International peace activisms, decolonization movements is not the task of the state, but it's belong also to the people. What happens in the Palestinian genocides and the response from the Western students universities in the US, in the UK struck me. Why they sacrifice their futures to protest, to making a tent in Cambridge, in Harvard, in Yale, in Oxford, the institutions that are labeled as elite, as aristocrat. But why that massive movements didn't happen in Indonesia, for instance? So my task as an academia and as a lecturer is just giving a sensibility back to my students, to my younger community, to academic community.
Thank you so much, Professor Wildan. Professor Farid, would you also like to address the question?
Yes, thank you very much, Vanessa, for the question. To which I think you know also the answer, because yes, of course, it's doable, and we are working towards that. And Wildan made a very great response to that. I think the question of sensibility, like having that sensibility, is very key thing. I'd like to add that it's not about like putting Indonesia back to the center, yeah, but Indonesia becoming part of that conversation, like an ongoing conversation. That's a very important. So what we think more, should think more about is the circuit, like rebuilding the people circuits, short residencies, pop-up studios, and it's right now it's actually happening. Like lots of Indonesian artists, writers are doing that. Regularly with their counterparts in Southeast Asia. So that is one way of reviving that. And what we discussed in this session, I think, is the archive circuits. Wildan has done extensive research, like very important materials, and I think if we kind of like revisit all these archives, that's also a very important move, not only to understand what was actually being done at that time, but also to increase that sensibility that Wildan was talking about. And also circulation is very important, yeah? And I think we need to do more into that direction, to read more from each other, like about each other. And translation is a key thing. I do agree, Professor, you said like it's not simply a method, it's a constitutive process, and that's exactly what we need to, how we need to think about this. So yes, it's doable. I think this conference, the Spirit, is also working towards that, like rebuilding all these connections that we have. And yeah, lastly, I think this cultural project also needs to be rooted in material solidarities. Yeah, like cultural projects should be combined with concrete actions. And this is, I think, a dimension that has been missing, yeah, in our attempts to do that. Like we tend to think of literature, culture as separate, like from material-based movements, and we need to rebuild that connection.
Thank you, Dr. Farid, Professor Mendoza, Professor Gonzales. Okay. I think we have time for one or two more questions. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the interesting discussion of some of the areas which I think requires further scrutiny. I think one of the failure of Bandung is a failure to build institution, which I mentioned earlier. You see, in politics, for example, Indonesia itself, soon after Bandung, when the 1955 election failed to provide a stable government, the country deteriorated in terms of its political management. And yet Bandung's spirit of having a peaceful resolution of conflicts was never practiced within Indonesia itself. There was no internal building of institution. The rebellion in Sulawesi, the rebellion in Sumatra, was dealt with in terms of force. And then the 1957 imposition of martial law in Indonesia. In 1959, the guided democracy and the dissolution of Constitutional Assembly. And of course, the 1965 is. So what I'm trying to say is that there's no build of institution within Indonesia itself to resolve conflict in a peaceful way. Of course, it's a big issue, which I don't want to discuss now because that is more difficult. But going back to literature itself, I think even in literature, within Indonesia itself, the institution that used to promote literature has been, after 1955, slowly deteriorated. I want to quote, in Indonesia there was a very established institution called Balai Pustaka, which was developed by the Dutch. Initially, it was an attempt to control the flow of ideas, but subsequently, the indigenous writers began to write, and then a lot more readings, and that encouraged a reading culture in Indonesia. I want to quote Pramoedya's comment in 1957. He says that Balai Pustaka harum namanya di dunia international dahulu. Kini hampir tidak berjamaah lagi. What Pramoedya said, to translate in English, is that Balai Pustaka, which was developed by the Dutch, was famous internationally before. But in 1957, it has no more life. What I'm trying to say is that if you don't develop institutions, you cannot expect to have this Afro-ASEAN supranational institution when the institution within the country itself is not developed to develop literature, things like that. And related to that, I also noticed that national libraries, for example, of various countries, which was developed after independence, has never attempted to engage in a collection that is beyond the national boundaries. You know, colonial, the imperial countries, like example, like United States and Britain, if you look at a library, it is not about collection of within the boundaries. The collection goes into multinationals, multicultural, and that is the power of the imperial force. The ability to harness the knowledge from every part of the world and provide authority on those subjects. Many countries, in developing countries, the national libraries never develop collection policy. They're beyond their borders. Indonesia could have done that because it's very huge. It could have at least become a national library of the region, in the sense that it collects materials from the region, and in the process becomes a center of research about the region. That is what I mean. If you build institution within, then we can talk about spreading culture, sharing cultures. Otherwise, it is just a lot of talks, nice talks, but when you go back, nothing is going to happen. So building institutions becomes important. Building libraries, a national library which has got a very regional or international scope, becomes very important. Another thing that I want to add, in the age of AI, such thing becomes more and more important. Because if you look at it, the narrative about Southeast Asia is much less as compared to narrative about Europe or about America. And if these things are not in the digital world, the way AI harvests information and project it will be affected. That means if AI were to do if you try to search about Southeast Asia, about Indonesia, the lack of narratives about this region will affect what comes out in the answers for AI. So this having digitized materials out in the public domain becomes very important. And you need an institution to build all that. Just my comment on building institutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that contribution. Would any of our panelists like to respond to that comment on institutions? Professor Weldon?
Yeah, probably Hilmar Farid is better to respond about the buildings in institution. I just want to respond to the local rebellions after Bandung, how Bandung's rise, peaceful coexistence by why they are repressive with the local rebellions. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's a very paradox to some extent. After the Bandung conference, there are local rebellions in Sumatra and in Sulawesi that Bapak mentions, and the Indonesian central governments put the repressive act to the local rebellions, but they have a reasons because they have a proof that one of the rebellions in the what is that, in the West Sumatra was funded by CIA. So the rebels, one of them was connected to the present regime now, seeking funding to the United States to, what is that, to support the rebellions, to what's that, dissatisfied with how Indonesians more concentrated developing Java compared to other regions. There's still problems in Indonesia today, but the proof that they're seeking funding from the United States, especially CIA, it makes an anger in the Indonesian state leaders. So that's why perhaps there is a response to the local rebellions.
Thank you so much, Professor. Well done. Professor Farid, would you like to add anything?
Just a few comments. First of all, thank you for the comments. And I think the problem at that time wasn't just that politics. Yeah, it was really a missing architecture of institutions, as you mentioned. And I think today we need durable structures, yeah, that would outlast election cycles and personalities. No? And this is a very important thing to do. When I was still working for the government, that is also what I had in mind, yeah, to build that architecture. And the state certainly cannot do it alone. It shouldn't try. Yeah, it's very important for us to bring local initiatives, non-governmental actors to the same table. Small publishers, community libraries, etc., etc. So, and if we give them stable roles and budget lines, of course, yeah, we can expect this to grow into something meaningful. This is what we had in mind when we created the National Endowment Fund, the Dana Abadi Kebudayaan. And so, yeah, the idea is not for the state to intervene and create things, because it's the civil society's job, yeah, to run the circuits. And the state is there to support initiatives like that. And if we do that, I think we can move from commemorating Bandung to really actually operating it. So yeah, thank you very much for the very thoughtful comments on that.
Thank you, Dr. Farid, for the wonderful insights. Professor Mendoza, Professor Gonzales, would you like to add anything? Okay, since I think our panelists are good now, though we would like to entertain more questions, we are approaching noontime, which means it will be lunchtime. So I would like to thank again the Professor Farid for the wonderful keynote address, and Professors Mendoza and Professor Gonzales for the response, and Professor Wildan for participating in today's question and answer. So before we conclude this morning's event, I would like to present the certificates of appreciation. First to Dr. Hilmar Farid for participating as keynote speaker for the Asian Literary Forum 2025, 𝗍𝗫𝗁, the Spirit of Bandung at 𝗍𝗫, given this November 7, 2025. Let's give a round of applause for Professor Farid. And to Professors Anthony G. Mendoza and Professor Vladimeir Gonzales for participating as reactors for the Asian Literary Forum 2025, 𝗍𝗫𝗁, the Spirit of Bandung at 𝗍𝗫, given this November 7, 2025. So Dr. Farid, I think the Institute of Creative Writing will find some way to get this certificate to you, or when you visit here again in the Philippines, the certificate will be waiting in UP Diliman. So again, thank you so much to our keynote speaker, our panelists.
And also likewise, we're presenting the Certificate of Appreciation, palitan lang, to Lakan Umali for participating as our moderator for the Asian Literary Forum 2025, 𝗍𝗫𝗁, the Spirit of Bandung at 𝗍𝗫, given this November 7, 2025. So thank you so much, Lakan.
Thank you, Professor Gonzales. Remind everybody to answer the feedback forms provided by the organizers of the event, and we will return at 1 p.m. for this afternoon sessions. Thank you so much.
Of creative writing for hosting this discussion. in this Q&A, which highlights problems, challenges, as well as possibilities. Thank you also for our colleague Lakan Umali for moderating the session. Okay, before we adjourn for lunch, here's a quick look at today's remaining schedule. At